All right, let's talk some fights. We're going to go Bellator heavy here because Bellator has been making big news the last couple of days. I don't know how much you've seen of it in international waters, Frank, but first of all, our good pal Chael Sonnen has his next fight made. He is going to take on the axe murderer, Wanderlei Silva, in a fight that was supposed to happen years back in the UFC.
Oh, wow.
It's going to headline a card at Madison Square Garden in June. Here's the real kicker. It's going to be on pay-per-view. Bellator is going to make their sophomore effort at the pay-per-view business. Now, that's going to be the headliner. And Fedor Emelianenko versus Matt Mitrione will be the co-headliner. That's another fight that's been rescheduled. We can speculate on who else might be put on that card, but right now, as I tell you that news, Frank, with Chael and Wanderlei in the main, Fedor and Mitrione in the co-main, pay-per-view in June, how do you think that sells?
I think it does unbelievable. I mean, Chael Sonnen is a huge draw. I mean, we've seen how many. I mean, just recently his numbers with Tito Ortiz. I mean, Tito's still a big draw, but I still think that Chael makes one hell of a fucking interesting case to watch him fight.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think I think guys like Connor are good at selling fights, but honestly, I think as far as marketing and the ability to talk and on the fly to make things up, I think Chael's kind of second to none, really. He's one of the best with the mic. And so, I think there's a huge backstory between Wanderlei Silva and him. I think the animosity is going to be 100% genuine. I know for a fact that Wanderlei Silva despises Chael Sonnen. If he could get the referee out of there and fight him to the point to where it really came down to the fact that the two of them entered, only one of them left, Wanderlei couldn't be happier.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be an exciting one. I think Matt Mitrione and, Fedor's a solid coach.
I was thinking about this as far as I can remember. This would be the first time that the UFC has, in a sense, kind of done Bellator's marketing for them in terms of laying the predicate for this fight. Now, we were talking on our last episode about the rumors that Matt Hughes is considering a comeback fight in Bellator, and by the way, there's a little more news on that because Royce Gracie has weighed in and said he would take that fight in a second. So we may see Royce and Hughes Part 2 over in Bellator, but that fight did happen in the UFC. In the case of Chael and Wanderlei, that was a fight that was not only announced, it had a whole season of The Ultimate Fighter leading up to it where the two were coaching against each other. We had a press conference that I attended where, the fight was promoted, and it wasn't really until, pretty close to the 11th hour that the fight was called off. So in a weird way, it's like the UFC, even though it's a few years removed, kind of did all the advanced promotion for Bellator to eventually realize this opportunity.
Yeah, Bellator's doing a good job of taking advantage of where they can see to bring themselves into that position. The UFC can only keep so many people under banner unless they're going to start just paying guys to permanently retire. They're going to run into this situation, and I think they kind of did, with their old ambassador type spots that they, Forrest had, still has, but Forrest, works really well with the company. Matt Hughes had that ambassador spot. Chuck Liddell had an ambassador spot. And so essentially, I think that another way of looking at it was that these guys were put on payroll so that they would, and I think you and I had talked about that. You said that, they could basically, to the extent of their possible career, a guy can come back and still fight. We've seen Dan Henderson fight at 46, but I think that if you keep them on payroll until their late 40s, early 50s, you pretty much guarantee that you'll never have to have a situation where the competitor, Bellator, puts one of these guys on a headline fight, and that's the situation they're having now.
Yeah, it's a real opportunity for Bellator. I mean, the timing is right. As I say, I mean, they're still a distant number two, but they're making up quite a bit of ground because of timing, but also smart moves that they've made, and the majority of those would likely fall at the feet of Scott Coker. So no surprises there. All right, so if they announce it, by the way, the pay-per-view will be it's Bellator 180. That's going to be on June 24th. Now, I was looking to see what the UFC had planned around there, because it's also a good time to catch the UFC in a little bit of a lull, because if you think about it, Frank, that will be prior to the big July card that happens every year in Las Vegas. So the UFC will be stacking that card, and a lot of times what happens is, maybe the card the month before, the month after is a little light. And the UFC 212 pay-per-view, the pay-per-view for June, is going to be Jose Aldo versus Max Holloway. Now, that's going to be a great fight. That's a fight I want to see down in Brazil. But in terms of a couple of guys that, can really take to media to market a pay-per-view, neither one of them at this point are Conor McGregor on the mic. So that also probably leads a little bit to Bellator's benefit, that they're not going to be competing that particular month with a UFC card that right at the top of the card has, the kind of fighter like a Conor or a Ronda that's going to be all over mainstream television to promote it.
I agree with you. I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm curious if the UFC keeps it going, because we've seen in the past where they've now recently had cards that were going to, to go along with Bellator, and I think so they didn't have to deal with a direct correlation of competing. They didn't want to have that. So if I remember correctly, they had a fight scheduled the same time the Tito and Chael battle, and they canceled it. Now, obviously, that was because Bellator was going to be a non-pay-per-view event, so it's readily more available for people to watch that and not have to pay $60-some to purchase a pay-per-view. So I think they'll be on more of an even playing field if Bellator's doing a pay-per-view. But I'm curious if they decide not to either go one or two directions: one, tone it down and not even put one up, or go ahead and try to pull out some of their bigger stars that are draws on pay-per-view to go ahead and try to bury Bellator and start putting that narrative that they're still number one. Because I think that right now that's kind of what everybody's talking about. Bellator's on the rise. They're getting a lot more attention around the world, and UFC right now, they're in a downsizing stage of the organization. Everything is cutting back, letting people go, cutting corners. I was just sitting here talking to some of the guys, and they're talking about that. Now that when they with the fighters and they see at some of the events that UFC is renting hotel rooms that are 40 minutes away from the venue to save money, and that just shows you the mindset of where the UFC is right now. And I understand that they just spent $4.2 billion to purchase the company. Right now, they're trying to make this profitable as soon as possible. But I think that makes for a perfect storm for somebody to go ahead and really take over and increase their share of the hold of the share of MMA viewers.
Well, if I were to guess, I would think that the UFC of your two scenarios you just pitched on June 3rd at UFC 212, I would think what they would try to do is step on the gas a little bit, because they will precede that Bellator pay-per-view by a couple of weeks. So they have an advantage there, because let's say if they put on something that's very compelling to buy and you buy it the first weekend of the month, maybe you've already shot your budget by the time the third weekend of the month rolls around. As I look at the card right now for what's announced, besides the main event of Aldo and Holloway for the featherweight title, Kelvin Gastelum and Anderson Silva are going to be on that card. You figure right now that's probably sitting in the co-main event spot. But other than that, not a lot of things to drive purchases toward pay-per-view. I'm sure they could add toward that. Now, if you look at Bellator, because I do think we have to talk now, Frank, about what else you put on that Bellator pay-per-view card to really knock it out of the park. Because I do think that Bellator is going to have to do a little more than even the UFC would do on a given pay-per-view month in order to get people to do something they're not used to doing, which is paying for the Bellator product. Right or wrong, that Fedor Mitrione fight was going to be offered for free. So while I think it holds a legitimate place as a co-main event on a pay-per-view, I think Bellator is going to have to stack that card even deeper in order to make it really sellable. Now, I'm looking at Bellator's schedule, so let's talk about what other fighters they could add to that card to make it make it purchase worthy. I guess well, first of all, Michael Chandler's out there. They could put him on there. Always a great fight. Always great to watch him fight. But the thing is, if we're going to look at sort of marquee names that are recognizable to the average viewer, now we're about to see King Mo and Rampage Jackson fight. That's going to be this month on March 31st. So March, April, May, June, roughly 3 months away, depending on the outcome of that fight. I mean, you could put Rampage or Mo or both on that fight card, and I think particularly in the case of Rampage Jackson, that would probably help push pay-per-view sales a little bit more as well. What do you think?
Yeah, that would be huge. And then, I mean, if right now they can accelerate the whole Matt Hughes conversation.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I think that would be a massive
no, you know what? That's it. You're right.
Injection.
That's what you do. You put. I didn't even think about that. You put Hughes and Hoyce on that card for the old timers or the people who were in the habit of buying all the pay-per-views better part of 10 years ago, and that's a big sell. Now Bellator, and here's some more news you may not be aware of, but Bellator just had two big signings, two big free agent signings. One of them is Lorenz Larkin, and the other one is Ryan Bader. He is now signed with Bellator. So
those are the two big ones. I don't think people even understood why Lorenz Larkin was released from the UFC, but I think that's that conversation again of the guys that haven't quite made it to the superstar status, that they're feeling that they can go ahead and grab the guys in the lower tier, raise them up to that same level that a Lorenz Larkin was starting to become, but for a lot cheaper.
Yeah. No, I'll tell you what you do. You put Hoyce and Matt on there. You've already got Fedor and Mitrione, and you got Chael and Wanderlei headlining, and then you put Bader and Phil Davis on the card, as Davis is Bellator's lightweight champion or light heavyweight champion. And then something else for pay-per-view.
They fought once already, if I remember correctly. Wasn't it a little bit of a boring?
It was. It wasn't exciting. Bader beat him. That's certainly going to be the case Bader's going to have for getting an immediate title shot in the organization when he's got a win over their champion. Yeah, and I don't know how exciting it would be a second time around. There may be just kind of a lot of wrestling going on, but that's okay, because you can market it as a championship fight and a couple of UFC alumni without having to count on that particular fight to drive all the pay-per-view sales. So if that's if you could have a light heavyweight title fight in the first or second slot of a 5-fight pay-per-view, that'd be pretty impressive.
Yeah, that would definitely. And then, Brazil is still one of the biggest followers of the MMA. I mean, USA, Brazil, I know Canada's still big, but they get a lot of viewers from Brazil. And so having a Wanderlei Silva on there, having a Horace Gracie on there, that you really get a lot of that the Brazilian injection of viewers. And I think that makes for a lot of sales.